Today's first scripture lesson is from the book of Mark, chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. You will hear the pronoun he referenced. And this is the New Testament, so of course, that pronoun references Jesus. So listen now for the word of the Lord. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? How he entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." This is the word of the Lord.
Our second scripture reading this morning comes from Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it." The word of the Lord. Well, we continue our sermon series on God's top 10 list. This week we find ourselves with a different sort of commandment. You'll remember that in previous weeks we heard a lot about what not to do in order to live in a way that reflects God's goodness, a goodness that illumines God's gift of life to us. This week we encounter a commandment that we are told to do. We are told to remember the Sabbath, something that stems from the foundation of creation, something so holy and so important that even God took the time to do it. And since today is a holy day and a day of rest, it's Sunday, the day we literally observe Sabbath, I am going to follow in Pastor Tracy's footsteps and take off my shoes because this is holy ground and this is a holy time. If you would like to join me, you are welcome to. Maybe you're like me and you just want to kick back and get a little more comfortable. And so that's fine too. You'll notice as well that we've skipped over number 5 and have moved to number 4. And don't worry, your pastors still know how to count. Tracy will preach on number 5 next week, but I think it's fitting that we talk about number 4 today and go a little out of order because we need a little breather now that we have half of the commandments in the rearview mirror. And I think it's fitting as well to have one of our associate pastors preaching this morning because Tracy works hard to prepare a good word for us as she preaches most weeks. And I think every now and then we all need just a little bit of a breather. Every now and then each one of us needs a little bit of rest. And if you read my extra long pastor's letter in the newsletter this week, you'll know that taking a break and resting is not something we do very well in our country in the year 2023. We are always on, and there is data that backs that statement up. In my letter, I wrote about how that in the U.S., the average worker works hundreds of hours more each year than in other developed countries, and how we work on average 10 more weeks per year than workers do in Germany. Think about how mind-boggling that is. That means that every 5 years or so, Germans have gained an extra year of time to dedicate to rest, recreation, and relationships, a year more than us. And that's just one statistic. Here are a few more about Americans and rest or lack thereof. 3 out of every 5 American adults surveyed in 2022 stated that they feel more exhausted than they've ever been. About half of Americans with jobs report feeling completely exhausted both mentally and physically at the end of every single workday. 1 in 3 Americans are sleep deprived, which leads to increased rates of heart disease, obesity, depression, and other diseases. 89% of Americans have suffered burnout within the last year. Parents with young children actually spend less than 2 hours a day with them on average. Even parents with children under the age of 6. And it gets worse and worse as the child ages. And I don't have a statistic for this, but parents, I know how extracurricular activities take over the calendars. Enough of you have shared with me how crazy things are as a parent today. Every night of the week is a different concert, sporting event, theater performance, or school project. We spend so much time away from family in order to do all of the things we need to do, and yet Pew Research reports that about 3/4 of U.S. adults rate spending time with family as one of the most, if not the most, important thing to them personally, regardless of how much time they actually spend with their families. 9 in 10 say that they view spending time with family as extremely important. And you don't have to be working or a parent. Just turning on the news is a major source of stress and causes many of us to move in the direction of literal unrest. Another 3/4 of adults have said the future of our nation is a major source of personal stress and anxiety, leading to less sleep. It doesn't matter if you work or if you don't work, since today we live in the age of always on and constant connection. A significant majority of Americans report feeling uneasy if they leave their phone at home, and 70% will check their phones within the first 5 minutes of receiving any notification. We do this despite knowing how bad too much screen time is for us. And we continue to engage in this behavior and perpetuate these systems despite knowing how bad it is for our mental and physical health. We are a nation of exhaustion, of anxiety, of depression, and stress. So you can see why it might be important for us to rest, to catch our breath. This idea of Sabbath is fascinating to me. It's so much more than just a day of the week. The Hebrew word Shabbat literally means to rest or to cease. It's interesting, as I noted earlier, that God found this activity so important that God even rested at the end of the first creation narrative. It's foundational. Rest was created by God as a gift for us. So why are we so bad at it? Why do we lack the commitment to rest? Why does it seem like we progressively do this worse and worse? I know I'm guilty of it. I work more than I should. I don't spend as much time with my family as I should. I'm always connected with a screen. I spent this past week convicted of all the ways that I don't practice rest. I have trouble disconnecting. I stay late writing long pastor's articles that I'm guessing some of you saw the link of and thought, no thanks. But I stayed late. I couldn't put it down and wrote it anyway. And though I don't respond, I always check my email when I'm on vacation. I know it's not good, but I do it anyway so that I can feel a little more in control that next week when I return to work. And I know I'm not alone. Many of us feel a responsibility to always be on. So how can we reorient ourselves? What if we feel like we have to be constantly connected? in order to make sure nothing falls through the cracks in our lives. Because it feels like our society is stuck in this endless cycle of busy that goes around and around, and it's impossible for any of us to break out of, whatever the reason may be. Maybe we feel like we have to stay in this cycle in order to do a good job or be successful in our careers. Maybe our work expects it of us. Maybe we feel like the cycle of busy gives us purpose. Maybe we're afraid of pulling ourselves out of the busy because we're afraid to be alone with our own thoughts and see our own imperfections. Maybe staying busy is a control thing. It helps us to feel like we have power over the direction of our lives. At some point, though, we have to step away and disconnect from the busy and into God's goodness, a goodness that we were created to enjoy. It's good for us to rest. It's life-sustaining for each of us. Of course, we were created to have jobs and purpose, and we were created to be out and about, to be active and busy. But we were also created to rest and to slow down, to relax and enjoy the company of one another. We were created to enjoy God's lovely creation and spend time growing closer to our Creator, to give time for recreation, to see wonder and beauty in the world. It restores us. It helps us to be better at sharing our God-given gifts. So what I hope you hear me say this morning is that I'm not suggesting we step away from our responsibilities, but we also have a responsibility to give time for rest. We have a responsibility to let those other responsibilities cease so that we are able to receive God's gift of holy rest. And rest will literally make each of us better at what we do. Another study I read this week talked about how overwork is literally a story of diminishing returns. The harder we work without rest, the worse we are at what we do. It's science. And just look back to that sleep deprivation statistic. A lack of sleep leads to disease. It's unhealthy not to rest in more ways than one. In the past, I've seen our passage from Mark this morning used to almost counteract the idea of Sabbath. When the Pharisees criticized Jesus and the disciples for plucking heads of grain, Jesus responds by saying, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath." In his response, Jesus isn't saying, work extra hard, don't take a break, because the Sabbath is just a day of the week with a special sounding name, so let them pluck grain. No, he's saying the Sabbath is a gift for us to enjoy. It doesn't need unnecessary regulation, legalism, or red tape. And if you see someone who needs help, if someone needs to be fed, and it's your day off, feed them, help them. Of course, the point isn't to follow a set of rules. The point of this commandment is to offer yourself life and to do the same for others. This is a commandment about perpetuating and giving life. Sabbath sustains life. One commentary I read defined Sabbath as God's commitment to the well-being of humankind. Writer and seminary professor Carol Bechtel says that Sabbath reminds us to honor God who honors us by giving us a time to reset our pace, our priorities, and our lives. Isn't it interesting, then, that this is where we've ended up? In a way, I see a parallel when we look at the misguided thought processes of the Pharisees. They wanted to regulate and control the actions of other people rather than practice the theology of sustaining life. We do that in new and different ways today, but so similar to the Pharisees 2,000 years ago, because I think legalism and control is part of why we've ended up in this always-on place. We're always on, and so we expect the same thing from others. This culture of no rest that no doubt leads to unrest is a societal thing. We participate in this cycle, we perpetuate this cycle, we hold others accountable to stay in this cycle. Because in the age of always on, we expect the same from those on the other end of our screens. It's the age of instant gratification, receiving packages within hours of a placed order, the age of messaging the customer service or delivery people immediately because it wasn't done perfectly in the speedy and satisfactory manner we needed. The age of late-night work emails and text messages, the age of constant screen time. So what do? How do we get out of it? Like I said earlier, maybe we feel like we have to do all of the busy to keep our families and lives afloat. But all of the money in the world, all of the financial stability in the world, all of the stress that comes with being on 24/7 doesn't always make the busy worth it. If we find ourselves in positions where we can't disconnect, then it's worth discerning whether we can find a way out of that situation. Like, I would still wonder if it's worth your health if you have an overbearing supervisor who doesn't respect your time or boundaries. That might be a sign that God is calling you to a new place of employment. It's at least worth praying about and discerning. I also would wonder if another extracurricular activity is worth it. If you and your children already have a jam-packed weeknight and weekend schedule, and maybe the jam-packed schedule is a sign that your family needs to reinstitute family night. I don't think any of us are going to look back on our lives and think, you know what? I'm really glad I worked late on that night back in 2014 instead of spending time with my family. So let us look for ways to choose rest, even when it's hard to find the time, to intentionally look for time, to choose joy, to choose to rest in God's goodness, to grow closer to God, to enjoy the gifts in our lives. And if you choose to do that on a Sunday and spend time with our community here at Grace as your place to rest and worship, even better. What a gift to have a specified time and place for Sabbath. And also, let us be reminded to offer that kind of rest to our neighbors out in the world. As I was writing this, I kept reflecting on the need to offer rest to others, and I couldn't help but go to the character of Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge, who in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol overworks Bob Cratchit, who he also underpays. Scrooge was the literal embodiment of anti-Sabbath at the beginning of the story. It sounds simple, but in our interactions as Christians, we are called away from legalism and are in the business of offering rest to others. Let us be offerers of rest and grace, because that's who we are as followers of Jesus. We are not the ones who get caught up in Pharisaical legalism. Sabbath is meant to promote life, and we are called to be life sustainers. If you're like me and have turned on the TV at all over the course of the past week plus, you've seen the awful events taking place around the world in places like Israel, Palestine, or the Ukraine. Places filled with death, destruction, and sadness. Of course, it's important for us to be aware of this news, even if it may cause some unwanted stress or lack of rest. It's important for us to help care and help the innocent people who have lost loved ones or are in harm's way in whatever way we can, even if it's as simple as a prayer. But one thing I've been reminded of over the course of this last week is that we live in a world that can at times be chaotic, can at times seem void of hope or life, can at times feel unbelievably dark. And so it is that much more important for us to choose to nurture life, to care for each other. The importance of spending time with people and things that matter in this life, because we live in a fragile and sometimes very broken world. So let us catch our breath and nurture life in our communities. Let us spend time with our families and friends. Let us spend time with our community here at Grace. Let us spend time with God. Go outside, worship, read, take a nap, watch a funny movie, grab lunch with someone new, pay for someone else's meal, research organizations, and give toward humanitarian assistance to help innocent lives caught in the middle of conflict. Don't check your email. Go to the park with your children. I don't know, do something super out there. Eat leftover cake with the neighbor down the street. Start writing a book. Go to Fort Worth. It's not as far away as we make it out to be. Serve a meal at a homeless shelter. Do something fun. Go home and leave work at a normal time. It can probably wait until tomorrow. Look for time, however you can find it, for rest. Even if you can't find a full day in the week, try. But put down the phone, disconnect, and rest in God's life-sustaining presence, and choose to nurture life. Because we only have one life. May God's rest sustain our own. May we work to do the same for our neighbors, and in the process, live it up. Peace.